the workshop on research methods, international relations. Today, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Shomir Kumar Das, Professor of Political Science and presently the Director, Institute of Foreign Policy Studies at the University of Calcutta, India. Formerly Vice Chancellor of the University of North Bengal, Dean, Faculty of Arts, University of Calcutta, and Adjunct Professor of the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. He is presently the coordinator of the University Grants Commission Departmental Research Support Program on Democratic Governance, a postdoctoral fellow of the Social Science Research Council South Asia Program based in New York. He specializes in and writes on issues of ethnicity, security, migration, rights, justice, and democracy, and lectured widely in premier academic institutions in the US, Finland, France, and many other countries. We are honored to have you, sir. I would request you to please take over the session.
Thank you, Adrija. I think uh, I am audible to all of you. Uh, Connectivity at my end is not very good, but then you know that it's reasonably good so that I can address you. But please let me know if you have any problem uh, with uh, the bandwidth and my voice. Uh, Let me first of all begin with a word of thanks to JAIR, Jadavpur Association of International Relations, and I particularly thank Imon and others who have invited me uh, to deliver the inaugural lecture. Uh, Let me first of all confess very honestly that uh, although I am asked very frequently to teach research methodology, uh, whether at Institute of Foreign Policy Studies or in my own department, uh, I am not the one who believes that if you want to do research, you must do research methodology. Uh, Much in the same way as one can argue that one can, a child learns language without learning the grammar. And it doesn't mean that the child uses a language which is necessarily grammatically incorrect. So, if you ask me, I will say that uh, the research does not necessarily depend on your training in research methodology. In fact, uh, I can actually push the argument a little further and I can argue that the more you learn research methodology, the more unexciting your research finally turns out to be. Uh, so maybe that I'm not the best person to deliver the inaugural lecture, but Imon, Shivashish, and others being uh, very friendly to me have reposed faith in me. So, with this cautionary note, let me begin. What am I going to do in this address? Uh, by the way, the rules of the game will be that I will speak for maybe 1 hour, 15 minutes, or 1 hour, 20 minutes. And then we will have enough time for discussion. And I will request all of you to join the discussion so that I can also learn from what you feel about my address. But let me first of all sort of put uh, across the cards on the table so that you get to know what I'm going to talk about. You know that if you ask me that what is the objective of learning research methodology, uh, I will say that the key objective of learning research methodology is uh, theory building. And if you insist that I should have a caption, a title of today's address, it would be like this: theory building in social science research. Uh, I was not very sure whether I will have to be very specific to the discipline of international relations. So many of my examples may not be very relevant for the students of international relations, but I will try desperately to sort of make me more relevant uh, to the students of international relations as well. But basically, what I'm going to sort of build up has a lot to do with social science in general, much less to international relations. Uh, so the title is Theory Building in Social Science Research. And like I said, that social research is geared to the objective of building theory. Now, what does theory do? Uh, because because that's very important for us to know. Theory does two things. One, theory helps us organize a wide variety of information and data that our social research uh, churns out, scoops out. In other words, as you conduct your social research, what do essentially? You actually try to gather information, you try to gather data, but then you know that after a while your information and data become unmanageable, uh, and it's important that you organize them. And this act of organizing information and data is the primary task of theory. So, theory helps us understand what these information and data mean. You can say that it's a shorthand way of storing in our mind a wide variety of data that we are otherwise we find difficult to learn. And that helps us understand the distinction between information on the one hand and knowledge on the other. So much of what you gather, let's say, from the internet is in the nature of information. And I don't describe information. I don't think information and knowledge are the same. Knowledge is organized information. In other words, information which is organized on the basis of some principle on the basis of which information is organized or data are organized, data are retrieved, for instance, from the net or from whatever sources you think of. So that's the primary task of theory, that it helps us organize information and data that we gather by way of conducting our research. The second objective is to predict. In other words, a theory always helps us predict the future uh, courses of events. Now, for instance, you know that uh, I make a distinction between two examples, and please keep it in mind, and please follow me very minutely. Now, till, for instance, Isaac Newton discovered that there is such a thing called law of gravitation, everybody else believed that the apple might not fall on the ground. And why doesn't, I mean, it's possible, it's eminently possible for the apple to fly up rather than fall on the ground. But it took an Isaac Newton to come to the conclusion that the apple will never fly up, it will necessarily fall on the ground, because there is such a thing called law of gravitation. So these two examples, on the one hand, you know, till Isaac Newton's time, everybody believed that it's possible for the apple to fly up. But it's only after the intervention of Newtonian science that we came together that apple will never fly up. It will necessarily fall on the ground. So that helps us predict. In other words, the law of gravitation becomes the theoretical foundation on the basis of which I'm telling you that objects will never fly up. They will necessarily fall on the ground. The objects fall. So that's the prediction that Newtonian physics allowed us to make. So the second role of theory is to help us predict the future, courses of events, what's going to happen in future, for instance. Now, I'm not here to sort of dwell on what theory does in social science or in international relations, or for that matter, what role theory plays. My task here is different. That how does one build theory? And one builds theory through research. But then let me sort of fine tune and complicate the question a little bit. I will rather try to focus on how theories are built, because I will sort of draw your attention to different ways of building theory, because there is no one kind of theory in social science, and I'm sure in international relations as well. I was never a student of international relations, so my uh, knowledge of international relations was gathered through my friends, my exposure to Jadavpur, uh, my exposure to Jawaharlal Nehru University, so on and so forth. So you know that do not count on my knowledge of international relations very much, but I can tell you about social science in general, and I can always say that there is no one kind of theory. One talks about different kinds of theory, a wide variety of theories, so to say. And I will draw your attention to three major kinds of theory. And let me name them so that you know that you can actually uh, figure out the progress of this address. The first is what I would describe as empirical theory. And I'm sure that uh, many of you are familiar with this term uh, in your undergraduate days or in your maybe early postgraduate days. So that's one kind of theory which we describe as empirical theory, or which is described as uh, empirical theory. The second kind of theory, which I would describe as structuralist theory, and I'm aware of the fact that there is a resonance of structuralism in international relations as well, and maybe that during Q&A, uh, some of you will point out how my understanding of structuralist theory resonates with international relations. So this second kind of theory that we are going to discuss is structuralist theory, much of which I will draw from, let's say, linguistics, from anthropology, rather than from political science, sociology, or for that matter, from international relations. I would say that rather that what passes on in the name of structuralism in sociology, in social anthropology, in political science, or for that matter in international relations, actually is borrowed from linguistics, from uh, anthropology per se. So that's the second kind of theory that we are talking about. The third is what we will describe as post structuralist theory. And the focus will not be on so much on what these theories are. The focus for us will be more on how uh, these different kinds of theory prescribe ways of building theories. In other words, how we can sort of what is the structuralist way of building theory, or what is, for instance, the post-structuralist way of building theory, or what is, for instance, the empirical way of building theory. So you get my point that our I mean, I'm not going to sort of draw an exhaustive picture of what these theories tell us, the pluses and minuses of this theory, or the merits and demerits. No, the discussion will not be towards that direction. The discussion will rather be on how are these theories built. And I'm using this word building very uh, carefully, because you know that theories need to be built. Theories don't drop from the air. Theories are not out there. Then they need to be built, particularly in social science. So these are the three different kinds of theory, and let's begin our discussion. Uh, the first uh, uh, kind of theory that comes to our mind is empirical theory. And I will refer to, let's say, three or four components or three or four steps of building empirical theory, three or four steps, because step is a better word than components. The first is what I would describe as identification of variables. I'm sure some of you have some knowledge of what variables are. Uh, variable is an element which is subject to variation. Uh, Let me give you an example. So, if, for instance, let us take it that U.S. president is a variable, is an element, and an element that varies. For instance, you know that he can be a black, he can be a white. US president can be male or female, although all of us know that in American history, there hasn't been a single female president ever. And it's quite surprising. He can be tall, he can be short, he can be highly educated, like Barack Obama was highly educated. He may not be as much educated as Barack Obama was. He may be very rich, for instance, Donald Trump. He can be a humble person like Abraham Lincoln. In other words, US president varies along different criteria. For instance, age, sex, gender, height, education, social background, wealth, so on and so forth, and what have you. That's the reason why we describe this element of US president as variable. And you can think of any kind of variable in terms of the quality of variation. And variation, remember, variation along certain lines, like, for instance, sex, gender, religion, creed, the language one speaks, the height, the color of the eye orb, the color of the skin, the size of the skull. Because in physical anthropology, by the way, you know that the early British administrators in India were fond of measuring the skull size, on the basis of which they would classify different kinds of people in India and whether they are governable or not. So much of physical anthropology, in fact, dwells on skull size, whether you have an aquiline nose, color of the eye orb, whether your hair is curled or not. So that's one. So that's step one, I would say. The second element is what is called conjecture. Uh, you take any two variables, and what does conjecture do? Conjecture is basically an anticipation of the probable relationship between two variables, two or more variables. It could be more, but at the minimum, it has to be two variables. So you get my point that it's an anticipation of the probable relationship between any two variables. Anticipation, and an anticipation which may be based on information, but please remember that that information may be absolutely inadequate. So you make an inference. It doesn't have to be an informed guess. It may be uninformed guess, absolutely uninformed guess. Now, for instance, I give you an absolutely bizarre example, and I will carry on this example as we progress. Now, I can establish a connection between, let's say, shoe size of a person and US president. I can always say that the American presidents wear a pair of shoes which has the size of 7. And it's possible, for instance, you can actually sort of uh, scourge a lot of data and information and come to the conclusion that, in fact, American presidents indeed so far have used their shoes which are of the size 7. It's possible to establish such a connection. Or it could be, for instance, that when Cold War exists, and this is an example which I culled from your discipline, international relations, that as long as Cold War exists, so you have, for instance, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. And so you know that wars are avoided. In other words, there may be threat of war. You have, for instance, countries which go just a little short of war. You have, for instance, Cuban Missile Crisis. You have, for instance, Iran. You have Korean crisis, so on and so forth. I don't sort of bore you with all these examples you are familiar with, but I can always argue that as if the Cold War exists, then obviously you know that it preempts the possibilities of a hot or shooting war, and you know why it happens. All of you are aware of it. So there is a correlation between the persistence of Cold War on the one hand and the elimination of hot or shooting war, preemption of hot or shooting war. So this is called inference. This is called conjecture. I'm sorry. And I remember that conjecture is not based on, it doesn't have to be based on sufficient information. You may be underinformed, but you just make a guess. And indeed, as long as it is uninformed, so we describe it as conjecture. So that's second. The third step to the building of empirical theory is hypothesis. Now, all you have to do is to sort of translate those conjectures into hypotheses. Some of you may have some idea of what a hypothesis is. Remember that a hypothesis is a sentence which is formulated in a way that can be proven either true or false. So it's testable. Testability is what characterizes a hypothesis. Let me give you an example. Now, if I, for instance, argue that ghosts, for instance, are necessarily hostile to human beings, this sentence doesn't qualify as a hypothesis. Why? Because you can't see ghosts. So a hypothesis will have to be framed in a way so that it can be tested, and it can be proven either as true or as false. In the literature, you will also find a word which is also in circulation, which is called verifiability. That a hypothesis is always verifiable. If I say, for instance, X is taller than Y, then you can actually sort of measure whether it's actually true or false. It can be true, it can be false. If it is false, throw it away. And there will, I mean, it doesn't stand any argument. Immediately you throw it away. As if it is false, you throw it away. All right. Now, so this is the uh, third step, which is called hypothesis. So you now I make a distinction between conjecture and hypothesis. A conjecture may not be formulated in the form of a hypothesis. A conjecture can be of any kind. Like I said, ghosts are generally hostile to humankind. They do harm to us. But on the other hand, I mean, it is a conjecture, but it's not. It doesn't qualify as a hypothesis. But on the other hand, you can always argue that all hypotheses are conjectures, but all conjectures are not necessarily hypotheses. So only those conjectures qualify as hypotheses which have this quality of being testable. If they are not testable, throw them away. No one will shed tear if one's hypothesis is proven to be false. It is as simple as that. But sometimes the task, I mean, let me add a footnote to whatever I have said so far, is this that sometimes, that throwing away a hypothesis sometimes becomes very, very difficult. I mean, it's possible for the scientist to shrug off and say that, look, this hypothesis is false, so throw it away. But sometimes, that in history of the mankind, it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. I give you one example. I don't know how many of you have watched the Bengali version of Brecht's famous drama called, or for that matter, English version. You may have watched the English version of what is called Galileo, the great scientist who discovered that the earth moves around the sun, and it's not the other way around. But Brecht in this drama has shown how much insult and how do I describe it, ignominy Galileo had to suffer. As soon as he declared that the earth moves around the sun, he knew that he was making a revolution, because that till Galileo's time, everybody else in the world would have believed that it's the other way around, the sun actually moves around the earth. So Galileo actually turned the table around, but at what cost? Galileo was thrown into prison. He was actually pressurized by the clergy to admit to the whole world that his scientific discovery is false, which he refused. He said, no, nothing doing. I stick to what I have said. He was never allowed to see the sun till his death. Can you imagine? And he became completely blind because he had no exposure to the sun. Why? Because he said that the earth moves around the sun. That was his greatest mistake. So that's the reason why I'm saying that throwing away a hypothesis sometimes hearts, religious sentiments becomes extremely difficult. Nowadays, you know that we have to keep shut, even if we know that some of the things which we are made to believe are not acceptable by science and by scientific knowledge, by the criteria of scientific knowledge. So, social history and the history of building empirical theory do not share the same trajectory. They share altogether different trajectories. All right, and there is always a tension, a conflict between these two trajectories. The last step, and I guess this is the fourth step, is the importance of methods. So, how are you going to test the hypothesis? What will be the ground rules of verification? You need methods. Now, remember, and as I say this, I hasten to add that your methods of verification cannot be partial to any particular hypothesis. What I'm trying to say is this, that your methods must be neutral to the hypothesis. And please keep in mind this very word neutrality. It's very important. I give you an example, and please follow this example very carefully. I don't know how many of you have read, for instance, the great biography of Sri Ramakrishna. It's a partial biography. It's also translated into English. And you know what I mean, Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, which was written incidentally uh, by uh, one of his disciples, one of his devout disciples, who incidentally was also his doctor. Now, and I would strongly recommend that you read that chapter, which actually portrays the first encounter between the great guru, Sri Ramakrishna, and his disciple, Swami Vivekananda. And remember, Swami Vivekananda, he was an atheist, a young graduate from Scottish Church College, and uh, deeply uh, immersed in philosophical knowledge. And he found absolutely no reason why he should believe that that God exists. So he asked the same question in the very first encounter with his guru. And he said that I don't believe that God exists. And have you ever seen God? That was his question. The text which I read is in Bengali, so I'm translating it for you. I'm sure that the English translation also brings out the essence of this encounter. You know what Sri Ramakrishna's reply was? Sri Ramakrishna's reply was that yes, without any, without an iota of doubt. And he said, yes, I have seen her. I have seen the goddess. And remember that I see her much in the same way as I see you. All right. Now, why did I cite this example? Because you know that an ordinary mortal like me, or like any one of you, will not be able to see goddess in the way Lord, I'm sorry, Guru Sri Ramakrishna has seen her. No, we cannot see it. In other words, the method of observing the goddess is completely different. Although Sri Ramakrishna insists that the way I see you is exactly the way I see the goddess, I do not think that we can see goddess in the way Sri Ramakrishna had seen her. It has to do with a different kind of observation. and the observation which he was privy to, observation which is unique to Lord Ramakrishna. And like I said, that ordinary mortals like us will not be able to observe the goddess in the way Lord Ramakrishna could. So you get my point that this is not the method that I'm talking about, because this method of observation is very, very unique and peculiar to Sri Ramakrishna. You hate to use the word peculiar, but unfortunately, you know that I can't remember any word to describe this particular experience. It's peculiar because you know that we cannot observe the goddess in the way Lord Ramakrishna could. I'm not referring to this kind of methodology. I am talking about a methodology which is universal. The earth moves around the sun not just for Galileo, but for you, Adrija, or any one of you. So that's the most important point, that it has to be universal. It cannot be partial to either of the variables that we are concerned with. So you get my point that the methods which are universal. All right. Now let me sort of take you back to the sort of anchoring point. We were discussing empirical theory, and we were referring to 4 steps that empirical theory takes in order to build itself. First is variable, the second is conjecture, the third is hypothesis, and the fourth is verification. But then there is a problem, and let me show you a slide. I'm very, very technically impaired person, but let me sort of try to show you a slide. I'm not very sure whether I would be able to do it. Just give me a moment. Can you see it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And now let me take you to the next slide, which actually is what I was discussing. Variables, conjectures, hypothesis, and testing. This is the fourfold step to the building of empirical theory. I will not show it any longer. Let me take you to the next slide. Now, this gentleman, Karl Popper, his time span, as you can see, is 1902 to 1994. Now, Karl Popper was an Austrian. I mean, let me just sort of add a biographical note to Karl Popper, because I'm just assuming that many of you simply may not have heard his name. Had his training uh, as an apprentice with uh, a psychiatrist who had a clinic in Austria, I think in Vienna. Uh, and he had this habit of sort of writing down all the clinical cases of the patients, because that was his job. And he would accordingly brief his superior, who was a great psychiatrist of his time. So he had a good deal of experience with psychiatric patients, so to say. After a while, after a few decades in the profession, he was asked by London School of Economics to join the institution. And he was offered a special chair. And remember that London School of Economics was not very sure how they would describe the chair. So Karl Popper was given the prerogative of describing the chair in the way he liked. You can say that he described the chair as 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 philosophy of social science. That's how he described his chair. A great man indeed. But why am I sort of referring to Karl Popper? He wrote a book in the year 1963. A lot of things, by the way, were happening in the world of research methodology in the 1960s. And Popper probably was the harbinger. So he wrote a book in the year 1963 with the title Conjectures and Refutations. And I draw this word conjecture from Karl Popper's great book called Conjectures and Refutations. And I'm sure that Jadavpur Library will have a copy of or multiple copies of this book if it is not available on the net. So I strongly recommend that you read this book. Do not uh, be intimidated by the research methodology or all these high sounding words. Popper writes in a very, very sort of intelligible style. Now, Popper was a philosopher who, for the first time, brought to our attention the fact that verification cannot be the basis of a theory. In other words, he was making a critique of this very idea of verification. Because Popper asked the question that what do you do with verification? And Popper's answer is that in course of verification, what you essentially do is to confirm the hypothesis. So confirmation is the essence of verification. And why do I say essence? Because if the hypothesis is not confirmed, you throw it into the scrap heap immediately without batting an eyelid. Popper was the one who was arguing that confirmation cannot be the basis of a theory. And if confirmation is made to be the basis of theory building, then every hypothesis, it's possible to confirm every hypothesis on earth. Mark this word, on earth. So it becomes extremely, extremely difficult to reject a hypothesis. It's possible to gather evidences and to confirm each and every hypothesis. I give you an example. Now, it's possible, and it's a bizarre example, I know, and I will sort of make it even more bizarre. So, suppose one of you is interested in really figuring out the relationship between a particular shoe size and US president. And I'm sure it's possible to, for instance, historically confirm the hypothesis that all US presidents wear shoes with the size 7. It's quite possible. And Karl Popper says that, does that confirm your theory? Like I said, that this is a bizarre hypothesis. But then you know that it's possible to confirm this hypothesis. And it's possible to retain it. It's possible not to throw it into the scrap heap precisely because it gets confirmed. And maybe you remain alive for the next 50 years, 50 odd years, and you keep checking precisely the shoe size of each and every US president from now on, and you confirm the hypothesis. And Karl Popper would say, will you call it a theory? He says no. In place of confirmation, he brought in a concept which is called falsification. It's exactly the opposite. And I have just sort of lifted one sentence from Popper's great work, Conjectures and Refutations. This is actually just one sentence, I think two sentences from Popper and from that particular book which came out in 1963. Every good, and he keeps good within quotes, double quotes, every good scientific theory is a prohibition. Is a prohibition. It forbids certain things to happen. The more a theory forbids, the better it is. So you get my point. It tells you that if this theory is to be valid, certain things will never happen. That's what he was talking about. All right. So I think that that becomes very important, and that becomes a turning point in the history of empirical theory. Now remember that Karl Popper was very much ensconced in empirical theory. You can't sort of separate Karl Popper from empirical theory, but he was introducing a new dimension to the way we understand empirical theory. All right. So that's how, for instance, empirical theory is built. Let me now take you a second kind of theory, which we describe as structuralist theory. Uh, Let me sort of, for the time being, stop sharing the slide and take you back to some discussion. We'll come back to this theory because there is a quote which I need to read at some point. Now, you look at this very word structure, and remember that structuralists use the word structure not as noun but as verb. So when, for instance, your teacher asks you that how do you structure your thought, you take a moment and think how you can actually structure your thought. And it's in that sense, that structuralism came into being. First in social anthropology, and I'm just mentioning one name who is regarded as the father of structuralism. His name is Claude Lévi-Strauss. And remember that Claude Lévi-Strauss was teaching in France in 1950s, in 1960s. Lévi-Strauss, it's exactly the uh, same spelling that the famous denim company has, Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now who his students were. One of his great students was Louis Althusser. He was teaching at Collège de France. So it's a great lineage. Claude Lévi-Strauss, and then you have uh, Louis Althusser, and then all of us know who Althusser's great students were. You have, for instance, Mr. Michel Foucault. You have, for instance, Etienne Balibar. You have Pierre Bourdieu. So you can think of the tradition of structuralism. But let me, for the moment, take you back to Claude Lévi-Strauss. And I'm sure that Lévi-Strauss's structural anthropology, if I'm not wrong, incidentally, that book also came out in 1963, if I'm not wrong, at least the English translation. And I'm sure that your library will have a copy of this book, Structural Anthropology. In fact, you know that when I refer to structuralism, I request my students to read Lévi-Strauss. All right. Similarly, that what are the steps to the building of structuralist theory? The first is what is called synchrony. Synchrony means what? Synchrony means that in society, nothing exists in isolation. So everything is connected with everything else. So, how are different things connected? So, that if you think in terms of a human body, then obviously, it consists of the head, then a pair of hands, pair of legs, and what have you. But then the most important point, which is emphasized by the structuralists, is this, that a part which is cut off from the body is not exactly the part which is integral to the body. You get my point, that there is a distinction between a hand which is chopped off from my body and a hand which is integral to my body. The hand which is chopped off will not perform the same function. So, for instance, I wish I had a sort of blackboard where I can actually show you what I have in mind. Now, think of three alphabets: CAT, cat. And you can well argue that the word cat actually consists of these three alphabets. But if you stop at that, then obviously you are absolutely wrong. Why? Because you will have to tell that C comes first, A intervenes between C and T. And if you do not actually mention these qualifiers, then obviously it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense precisely because these three alphabets can make many other words, and often many other unmeaning words. For instance, ACT. So an alphabet which is taken out from a word, and in fact, linguistic anthropologists take the point a step further. They argue that even a word taken out from a sentence doesn't have the same meaning if it is inserted back into the sentence. So you get my point, that this is called synchrony, that everything is connected with everything else. Now, the second, let me take you back to the slides, because there is something which I need to share with you. Yes. The second is ordering. Before I read out this paragraph, this is one of my favorite paragraphs, which comes from another very eminent social anthropologist. His name is Edmund Leach. But before I come to this paragraph, let me just tell you, let me just cite an example. And this is an example of, let's say, 3, 4, 5 sentences. And these sentences are very random in the sense that they are unconnected. And they are apparently unconnected because they don't have any sort of relation with one another. Let me give you one example. An example of 3, 4 sentences which are very random. One is, for instance, that as you enter your worshipping room, you leave out your chappals outside. All right. If a friend comes to your place, then your grandma doesn't let her in the room where, for instance, household deities are worshipped. The Brahmin doesn't accept a glass of water if it is offered by a Dalit. Or, for instance, you throw, after sweeping your house, you throw the waste from the balcony on the road, on the public road. Now, all these are apparently unconnected sentences. It's very difficult to sort of find out the exact correlation amongst these 4 or 5 sentences. The structuralists, they will say that if as a structuralist you cannot find out how these random sentences are connected with each other, then you are a failure. So the real challenge is to find out how these different sentences are structured in the society. That's, in other words, that's what is called the structure. So please remember that the structure is not observable. You can't observe the structure. You must discover it. And you must discover it much in the same way as you know that the two-thirds of the iceberg remains hidden. So what you see is not real. So they have a different notion of reality. Reality is submerged, reality is hidden, what you can't see. And all you can see is just the tip of the iceberg, and you cannot make out anything. So how can the order be discovered? Order meaning the principle that actually orders a variety of these things which are expressed in all different sentences. All right. Now Leach actually gives you an answer, and let me read it out. By way of illustration, I shall borrow an example from Bertrand Russell. And all of you must have heard the name of Bertrand Russell. He was a great philosopher. And in our undergraduate days, our teachers would ask us to read Bertrand Russell's famous book, History of Western Philosophy. It's a wonderful text that I still recommend you to read. I listened to a broadcast version of a piano sonata. So, that think of a broadcast version of a piano sonata. The music has gone through a whole series of transformations. It started out as a score written on a piece of paper. Now, in Bengali, we call it Shorolipi. All of us know this. It was interpreted in the head of a pianist. So, that the notation remains the same, but then that not every Rabindra Sangeet singer can become Debabrata Vishwas. It takes one single person called Debabrata Vishwas to become a Debabrata Vishwas. So he interprets the song in the way he wants. It was interpreted in the head of a pianist and then expressed by movements of the pianist's fingers. The piano then produced a pattern noise imposed on the air, which was converted by electronic mechanisms into grooves on a gramophone record. So that Russell was talking about the olden days in our childhood, for instance, when gramophone records were very much in circulation. Now you don't have gramophone record. Even the CDs have become things of the past. Subsequently, other electronic devices converted into radio frequency vibrations. So that at each level there is a transformation. And after a further series of transformations, it eventually reached my ears as pattern noise. So who am I? I'm a listener. And it reaches my ears through a variety of transformations. Now, it is perfectly clear that something, and see, Leach has kept this word in italics in order to highlight it. Something must be common to all forms through which the music has passed. In other words, that there is an essence which never fails to reach me, notwithstanding all these transformations. Something is common and which is never lost. It is that common something, a patterning of internally organized relationships, which I refer to by the word structure. This book came out in 1954. And Leach has a book on the neighboring Myanmar. At that time, the name was Burma, Highland Burma. He was actually conducting his anthropological research the on the tribal communities of Highland Burma. All right. So I uh, again go back to what we were talking about, uh, and uh, so the first step uh, was synchrony. The second step is ordering, and let me give you an example. And if I do not cite this example, I think, how am I doing in terms of time? Yes, it's 1 hour now. So let me cite this instance, and I will be failing in my duty if I do not introduce all of you to this book. This is a book which a French uh, anthropologist has written on Indian castes, and incidentally, he was Levi Strauss's student. He was one of his illustrious students, and his name is Louis Dumont, Dumont. He wrote a book in French, the title of which is Homo Hierarchicus, and it's still widely referred as a must read text on Indian society. So, Dumont, for instance, argues that if you want to make sense of the society in India, and remember that Indian society is highly varied in the sense that it's divided into a multiplicity of castes, ethnic communities, language groups, religious communities, classes, and what have you. So much in the same way as I was referring to variety. But then Dumont says that how does one make sense of this variety? What is the ordering principle? The ordering is the principle that says that purity must be kept away from pollution. So the pure and the pure must be kept separate from the impure. They must not be mixed. Now you remember all those 4 or 5 random sentences which I have said. Each of these sentences has to do with this distinction between the pure and the impure. So you ask your friend, so you ask yourself to leave off your chappals as you enter the, the worshipping room in your house. So you don't allow, your grandma doesn't allow your, your Muslim friend to enter the Thakur Ghar or the room where the deities are worshipped. So you do not keep the waste after sweeping inside the home. You leave it and you throw it into the public road. So it's the same principle of purity and pollution. The pure must be kept separate from the impure. And that's the ruling principle, or that's the ordering principle. That's how the society is ordered. All right. The third criterion, or the third step, I'm sorry, the third step is called intelligibility. This actually is derived from ordering. Why intelligible? Because you know that at one level, the variety you observe is bewildering. It's puzzling. You cannot make sense of it. But at another level, if you have this ordering principle, and if you are able to discover the ordering principle, then everything becomes intelligible. You can explain why you are required to leave off chappals outside the room of the deities, why you are not allowed to keep the waste inside the home. so on and so forth. Why, for instance, a Brahmin refuses to accept a glass of water from a Dalit, because the Brahmin is considered as the embodiment of the pure, and the Dalit is considered as the embodiment of the impure. And you know that until and unless these two are kept separate, you know that the pure gets polluted. So it's like that. And the whole book, it's a quite voluminous book, is an argument in terms of illustration of this ordering principle. All right. So once you discover the ordering principle, then the society becomes intelligible. In fact, one of Dumont's statements that I can remember right now is this: that what is the use why French anthropologists should come to India and conduct their research until and unless they are able to make sense of the bewildering variety that India represents. So the challenge is to discover the ordering principle. And finally, what we will describe as predictability. So once you hold the key, which means you discover the ordering principle, then you can predict. It helps us predict. For instance, you know that if you know the ordering principle, the principle on the basis of which caste society is ordered in India, you can well understand why in a remote village of Uttar Pradesh, people have voted for the candidates representing their castes. So, a lot of writings on voting behavior in India actually is focused on how caste influences voting behavior, how caste equations, for instance, who aligns with whom. Why is it that that the schism between Shinde and Uddhav Thackeray, for instance, is explained in terms of caste equation. So that you can explain everything if you hold the key, in the sense that if you discover the ordering principle, that's how you can unlock the society, you can make sense of the society, and you can predict that that's how people are going to vote and who gets elected when and under what conditions. So these are the 4 steps to the building of structuralism. I will come over to the third kind of theory, post structuralism, and I will end there. Let me first of all begin with an example. And please follow this example very minutely, because I will keep referring to this example as the discussion progresses. Now, all of us know that the Ramayana, rightly or wrongly, is at the center of a great controversy. And I'm sure that many of you are from Hindi heartland, or at least have visited Hindi heartland. I was in Varanasi a couple of weeks back. And you know that what strikes one as one, for instance, walks through the roads and lanes of Varanasi is that that the large cutouts of Lord Rama at the intersections of roads and lanes and streets of Varanasi. And all of us know that these are very crowded, and it's the traffic is still absolutely uh, not disciplined. But that's a crude understatement of the kind of chaos that the Varanasi traffic experiences every day. That's another story. But I'm talking about the cutouts of Lord Rama. And these are actually sort of circulated by organizations which come under the Sangh Parivar. All of you know that BJP, for instance, RSS, Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, ABVP, even inside uh, the Banaras Hindu University, BHU, uh, or for instance, Bajrang Dal, so on and so forth. But what strikes you is this, that the kind of the figure of Lord Rama, the Lord Rama is projected here as a warrior, and he is for sort of fixing his arrow on on an imagined enemy. The enemy is absent. He or she is not to be seen anywhere. But then the aggressive posture of Lord Rama, that here is a Lord who is a great warrior and whose mission is to kill the enemy, is to sort of get rid of the enemy. And you know what I mean. So this is one kind of Lord Rama that you come across. And then you know that I will be talking about, let's say, two or three figures of Lord Rama. And remember that these figures are in divergence with each other. They're not one. And they're not only not one, but that they are in conflict with each other. Just give me a moment. So, that's one figure of warrior Rama. The second figure that comes to my mind is this, that you know that long back, Tagore asked one of the professors of Calcutta University, and he was a great professor. You may have heard his name, or you should have heard his name. His name is Dinesh Chandra Sen. He was the one who discovered the first Bengali text, uh, or text written in Bengali, Charjapad. You may have heard its name. So Tagore asked Dinesh Chandra Sen to write stories of the Ramayana in a language which will be understood by common people. So Tagore was very sure that many of us simply don't understand Sanskrit, but it's important that the stories of the Ramayana are popularized amongst the people. But Dinesh Chandra Sen said that I will carry out your order, but on one condition. And Tagore smiled and he asked what that condition was. Dinesh Chandra Sen said that I'm going to write it, but you will have to write a foreword to the whole book. Tagore agreed. So the book, titled Ramayani Katha, in fact, the title was given by Tagore himself, has a long foreword which was written by Tagore. And if you read Tagore's foreword very carefully, you will see that a different figure of Rama emerges from that foreword. Not Rama as the warrior, but Rama as someone's beloved son, Rama as someone who is someone's beloved brother, elder brother, as someone who is someone's husband, as someone who has two sons. In other words, you see a completely different figure of Lord Rama, who is someone of your family, father, elder brother, son, so on and so forth. Deeply embedded in a web of family relationships. And if I can, and even at this age, I wrote this book long back when I was a child, and we were actually sort of uh, my parents actually ensured that I read Bengali, and so I was exposed to these kinds of books in my childhood. Because you know that in our schools, you know that this was not, these things were not very much entertained. And if I can quote Tagore, I wrote it long back, but the memory is very sharp, particularly in respect of this particular sentence. And please allow me to read it in to tell you in Bengali, and then I will try to translate it into English to the extent it's possible for me to do. It's very difficult to actually translate Tagore's text into English. রামায়ণের মহত্ব এই যে তাহা ঘরের কথাকেই বড় মহৎ করিয়া দেখাইয়াছে. So you get my point that the greatness of the Ramayana lies in the fact that it actually celebrates the stories of our very home. So another home is the object of celebration. It's not warrior Lord Rama who is killing imagined enemies. And remember that Sheldon Pollock, the great Sanskrit scholar of the University of Chicago, actually wrote a long piece, and he tried to argue that the enemy in the Ramayana has changed over the years. Earlier it was the demons. Then, for instance, you know that the enemy became the Muslims became the enemy, so on and so forth. So how over years, over decades, the enemy, the definition of enemy has changed is a very important point that Sheldon Pollock was referring to. So taking you back to what Tagore was arguing, Tagore was not arguing that Rama was a great warrior. Tagore was instead arguing that he's a perfect family man, deeply inserted a family, into a family network. The third figure that comes to my mind, and there I will end because I can tell you endless stories, is the one lecture that a great Sanskrit scholar has written, and she used to teach Sanskrit at Jadavpur University. Her name is Sukumari Bhattacharya. And she delivered this lecture long back in Bengali, and this Bengali text is available. So I strongly recommend that those of you who are interested, please read and can read Bengali, please read it. It's a wonderful text. And she was trying to find out how, for instance, the Dalit women of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Uttar Pradesh, how the Dalit women of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh view Lord Rama. Because you know that after a day's hard work, the women assemble in one place in a chopal, and they share their stories, and they also sing songs. I mean, how is Lord Rama portrayed in these songs, folk songs? And there comes the true meaning of the Ramayana, that it portrays Lord Rama as someone who is neglectful of his wife, who didn't do husband's duties, because he dumped his wife. And he was raising questions about the fidelity of his wife. He dumped his children. So a neglectful husband, a husband, and Sita as the great woman who suffered everything and suffered silently, didn't raise a word against it. So it's a feminist understanding, Dalit feminist understanding of the figure of Lord Rama. So three figures I have portrayed. Now, if I ask you a stupid question that which figure do you subscribe to? Which figure is true? I said it's a stupid question that I will never ask. Because probably all these figures are true. Keep that in mind as we enter into a discussion on post-structuralism. All right. So I will refer to three steps that theory building in post-structuralism takes. Three steps. One is the distinction between a text and a discourse. And I'm sure that all of you are in the habit of using discourse. Discourse is something which slips from one mouth to another very fast, very rapidly. Although I'm sorry to say that very few of us actually know the true meaning of discourse or are familiar with the way, for instance, the concept is used in social science. So we make a distinction between a text and a discourse. In what way? A text is plural and a discourse is unitary. A text is plural, a discourse is unitary. What does that mean? Now, I said that the question I asked, that which figure of Lord Rama you think to be true, I said that this is a stupid question. Why do I say that this is a stupid question? Because if you ask the text that which figure is true, the text will respond back, will reply back by way of saying each of them. Each of them is true. Because it's possible to sort of construct each of these three figures. There are many other figures, for instance. I have not referred to Michael Madhusudan Dutt's Meghnad Bodh Kabbo for want of time. I have not, for instance, referred to Adbhut Ramayana. So all different figures of Lord Rama are portrayed. Madhusudan, according to Madhusudan, for instance, Lord Rama certainly the cherished figure. The cherished figure is Ravana, who stands on his own might, and Rama is divinely blessed. But that's a different story. So let's restrict ourselves to these three figures. And if we ask, for instance, Valmiki, who wrote this text, the same question, if we take it back to the author of the text, that which figure is true, he will laugh it off by saying that each figure is true, because it's possible to sort of gather quatrains and stanzas from the text in support of each of these three figures. Each figure is true. It's very difficult to discard that no, the third figure and the second figure are wrong, the first figure is true. So text is plural. And remember that why is the Ramayana as a text different from, let's say, one of my research papers? Precisely because you know that the Ramayana is plural. The more you read, the more you are exposed to newer, ever newer meanings. You discover ever newer meanings. So that's the distinction between me as a poor social scientist and Valmiki as the great author. So you know that not everything that is written is a text. A text has to be plural. And remember that the plurality is integral to the text. So when I say, for instance, I read my mind into the text, say that the text responds back, talks back. And the text says, yes, yes, you are true. You are right. You get my point. So that's one. And on the other hand, when you talk about a discourse, what does this mean? It means that it establishes itself by way of ruling out the other figures. So when, for instance, you see the large cutout of Lord Rama at the intersection of one of the ghats in Varanasi, then obviously what do you mean? It means that stands alone as the only figure of Lord Rama. It 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 eliminates all other figures. All right, so discourse is what? Discourse is Caesar of the text. Caesar, meaning that it captures the text. And it tells you that, look, the way I understand the text is the only way, and you must abide by it. So no one can actually dispute it. All right, and therein lies the problem. So we make a distinction between text and discourse. The second step is, which follows from the first, is this, that so discourse is violent. So there is inherent violence in the birth of a discourse. All right. I think I should read out a particular sentence from one of the post-structuralist writers. Otherwise, I will be failing in my duty. So please allow me to sort of take you back to the slides. I'm not very fond of sort of showing slides, and particularly slides which are text dense. So look at this slide and look at this part, which is a couple of sentences which are taken from Paul Ricoeur, and he wrote it way back in 1974. And I read it out. I'm sorry. How do you go back? Yes. A discourse, and read it very minutely. A discourse consists in a series of choices. Remember, choices. So you make a choice. Which figure is true? By which certain meanings are selected. So you select certain meanings, others excluded. Exclusion is important. All right. The choice is a counterpart of a corresponding trait of the system, constraint. So a system tells you that you can't move beyond it. You will have to remain within it. All right. Which is very important, because you know that you can't trespass. So when your teacher, for instance, you know that and I'm accusing me as a teacher, because when we, for instance, ask our students to read a particular text, we say that, look, this is the way you must understand the text, and there is no other way. So we don't encourage the students to read the book in the way they want to do. So it's a discursive seizure of the text. So you know that we do violence to the text by way of saying that, look, this is the only way that you can read the text. All right, I'm skipping the next bullet point because I really want some time to be kept for discussion. And then I come over to heterotopias. Now this is a word which is quite mouthful. Now, as I say that discourse I have used some very strong words that discourse is violence, discourse is aggression on the text, Dis- discourse is capture, discourse is seizure. But if you ask me that is the seizure, is the capture total? And my answer is no. It can't be total. So heterotopias are those fragments of the discourse which lie scattered after the discourse captures the text. So even after the discourse captures the text, there are certain fragments, certain pieces which are now, for instance, a house which is discarded for long still has some parts which can be used for other purposes, for building another house. For instance, you know that it's dilapidated window, its iron bars, the bricks, the mortar, for instance, so on and so forth. Now, I'm sure that all of you have heard the name of Edward Said. Edward Said describes it, and I like this word, usable debris. Usable debris. It's debris. It's discarded. But then you can be, I mean, these can be rendered useful as you, for instance, try to reconstruct. All right. So these are called heterotopias. Heterotopias are those fragments, those pieces. Then I will cite one example and I will stop. Let me take you back to what we were discussing. Now, let me give you an example of heterotopia, but the theoretical point was articulated by Michel Foucault in one of his excellent essays called Nietzsche Genealogy History. It's a sort of one breath essay which one must read. The argument is that how do you describe or define the present? Present meaning the time when we live, now, for instance. And Foucault has offered a definition of the present by way of saying that present is what? Present is elimination of those possibilities which could have happened but had not had happened. So you get my point that those potential possibilities, those potential things which could have happened but had never happened. And this is the theoretical point that Foucault made, that it eliminates those possibilities and it establishes its hegemony by way of defining that, look, I am the present. I take this theoretical point in order to now cite the example. Now think of partition of 1947. Two states emerged, India and Pakistan. All of us know that. But how many of you know that there were potential candidates of at least 4 or 5 states? For instance, since Sindhis wanted a separate state, the Sikhs wanted a separate Sikhistan, people from the south wanted a separate Javidistan, and leave alone the Balochs, and the problem is still simmering. All of you are aware of it. So those possibilities were ruled out. And remember that many people at that point of time did not want to join either of the two nation states. In 2022, I, in fact, had the opportunity of working in I'm sure all of you have heard its name, in the 1947 partition archive. So I was basically interested in knowing not how Hindus were viewing partition or Muslims were viewing partition. These are commonplace stories. I was interested in knowing how, for instance, transgenders, the Hijras, for instance, viewed partition. And it is for this reason that I got a fellowship and I had the opportunity of studying using their archive. They have 10,000 stories, oral histories of partition, which are archived. And all of you know that it's basically a people's archive, which is maintained by Stanford University and then Ashoka University, Delhi University, and what else? Guru Nanak Dev University in Amritsar. So I was interested in hearing the transgender stories. So is this story different from the way, for instance, Hindus or Muslims have viewed partition? And indeed, because even now you know that the hijras of, and I mean the protocol is that I will never be able to share the names of these hijras, the places they come from, and I'm observing that protocol. But then you know that many of them, actually not many, I could get only 6 such stories, and all of them actually pointed out that for them India or Pakistan means the same thing. You know that they didn't have any nostalgia about the past. They don't want to come back and see what their village was, where they spent their childhood, precisely because you know that for them it's a difference between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. It matters little, because in both places they are persecuted. So they want a space where they will have their own house. They want a space where people of their kind live, so that they are not harassed. And the Hindi word they use is chair. You know, it means teasing. So you get my point that they have an altogether different idea of space. They don't want a separate state. They want a space of their own. All right. So, but that's a different story. I describe it as heterotopia. A piece of history which never allows the partition story to become complete. So you know that partition story is perpetually incomplete, is perpetually inadequate, precisely because you know these are the other stories which constantly nibble and prevent the partition stories from becoming complete. So I stop here. What I will do is to sort of uh, take you back to the last slide, which actually lists out the references which you might find useful. The only point that I must say in this connection is that read the books following the sequence, because you know that do not begin with the last book. I have actually sort of organized them in a way so that this becomes reader friendly. All right, so I'm taking you back to the last slide, and I will stop there. If you have got any question, comment, or whatever, please feel free. So this is the last slide, and uh, you can well imagine that these are the books which I would request you to read. Uh, and I have picked up those references which will sit easy on our heads. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience. We have at least 20 minutes time for discussion. So I stop here and I mean, can I stop the presentation now?
Okay, sir.
Thank you. Yes, I see one hand being raised by Kiran. So please go ahead. You can turn on your video and audio and ask your question.
Sir, could you please elaborate more on falsification?
Yes, you know that uh, if I say, for instance, that a theory is based on confirmation, then Karl Popper argues that every theory, each and every theory can be confirmed that way. If each and every hypothesis can be confirmed and can be established as a theory. Now, like I said that, for instance, you know that if I say that every American president wears a shoe with the size of number 7, and it can be found to be true. I'm not very sure. Don't take my words as true, but it's possible that this is true. That all U.S. presidents have used their shoes with the size number 7. So Karl Popper argues that confirmation cannot be the basis of theory, because if you make it as the basis of theory, then all hypotheses can be proven to be true. Karl Popper, on the other hand, turns the table around. He says that not confirmation, but falsification. In other words, a theory will tell you that if this theory is to be true, then these things will not happen. These things will not take place. So it forbids, it prohibits certain things from happening. Let me give you an example. Now, for instance, you know that if a Cold War occurs, and this is a story that I'm sort of bodily lifting from international relations, then obviously, you know, you can't say at the same time that there is a war between the US and the Soviet Union, the, the Soviet Union. So if the war takes place, then obviously you know that the Cold War cannot exist. The war no longer remains cold. It becomes a hot and shooting war. So Karl Popper would say that the theory of Cold War actually prohibits a hot and shooting war to take place. This will never take place as long as Cold War is going on. All right, and it is for this reason, you know, that the theorists of Cold War have written so extensively on such situations when the US and the Soviet Union have been very close and were about to start a war between themselves. You think of, if I'm not wrong, I read it long back, Schlesinger's work on Cuban Missile Crisis. You think of, for instance, Korean Missile Crisis. I'm sorry, Korean Crisis. You think of Iran Crisis. You think of Berlin Crisis, one after another. All right, but what do they tell you? The if I formulate all these writings in just one sentence, they tell us one thing: that look, here was a warlike possibility, but the war never took place. So we are right in saying that the war remained cold. So our theory of Cold War is always good, is good. All right, I don't know whether I could actually explain it to Kiran, but let us have other questions as well. Thank you. Thank you, Kiran.
Thank you, sir.
Shagnik, go ahead. আর তোমরা যারা বাংলায় প্রশ্ন করতে চাও তারা বাংলায়ও প্রশ্ন করতে পারো, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই। আমি বাংলাতেও উত্তর দেওয়ার চেষ্টা করব, বাংলাতে উত্তর দেব। কামিং ব্যাক টু সাগনিকস কোয়েশ্চেন, নাও যদি ধরো, ইফ ফর ইনস্টেন্স, what was Lord Ramakrishna's reply to Swami Vivekananda when he was raising question that whether the Guru has ever seen the goddess? ঠিক এইরকম ভাষাই উনি বলছেন যে, আই এম সরি, আমাদের there are people who don't understand Bengali as well, so the language is something like this, that you know that you are chanting the name of the goddess day in and day out, but have you ever seen her? Have you ever seen goddess Kali? So this was the blunt question. And the blunt answer of Lord Ramakrishna is that yes, much in the same way as I see you. Why did I cite this example, Shagnik? I cited this example because very simple reason. The simple reason is that although Lord Ramakrishna says that I have seen goddess in the way I see you, we know that not you and I will be able to see the goddess in the way Lord Ramakrishna could see. This was a different kind of sight. This was a different kind of observation. An observation which is not available to us because it is after, let's say, a lot of meditation that you can achieve that kind of power to observe. All right. Now I come back to your question. I said I use this word neutral. Why? Because when Ramakrishna calls for this kind of observation, this observation is very peculiar to him. It's not available to us. So the methods of observation, and in this case, one single method of observation, is very unique to Lord Ramakrishna. It's not available to us. Contrast it with what Galileo was doing. The earth was moving around the sun, not for Galileo, but for everyone. So you can go out, you can see, you can check if you have the instruments. So the results do not make a distinction between Sagnik and me or Galileo. The results are the same. And that's why I say that the methods are neutral in this case. But in that case, the methods are very unique, very specific to Lord Ramakrishna. Is that clear to you? বলো আর কোনো যদি প্রশ্ন থাকে।
Yeah, good evening, sir. I have a question.
Yes.
I would like to ask, what is the difference between post-structuralism and postmodernism?
It's a very difficult question. Difficult question in the sense that you know that at one level there is absolutely the blunt answer to your question is no, there is no difference.
Okay.
But at another level, you know that Foucault says that I'm a post-structuralist, but certainly not postmodernist. Foucault refuses to believe that he was a postmodernist. And let me try to explain insofar as I can remember. My memory is faint in this respect. Why? Because post-structuralism is a method of understanding the reality. So you know that Post-structuralists, for instance, will never use the word truth with T in capital because there is no truth. There are only partial truths. T in small. All right. In fact, you know that there is a book which is a collection of essays, which is a good textbook on methodology. This is called Writing, I think Writing Difference or something like that. I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly the title of the book. But the first essay is called Partial Truths. The truth is always partial. So post-structuralism is a method which I would say at one level doesn't believe in homogeneous truth, but at another level, in fact, says that all truths are actually truth claims rather than truths. Truth claims. They can be claims to truth. Now, by way of arguing this, you can ask me that how do we gain? We gain by way of contesting the hegemonic claim of truth. You know that, for instance, if someone says that, look, my understanding of Lord Rama is the only way you can understand Lord Rama. And in fact, in most of the classes in language and literature, you know that that's how the texts are taught. Then obviously you are absolutely wrong. You are absolutely wrong because you know that you completely forget the politics behind it. Now, politics is, you can say, the politics lies in the act of bringing back the plurality and to pose one truth against another and to contest. All right. But on the other hand, you know, what is postmodernism? You are coming back to your question. Postmodernism, in a sense, doesn't have any politics, in the sense that you know that it simply says that the narratives, the I would say, how do I put it? The It's called grand narratives, or let's say truths with T in capital. They are dead. So they are dead, but they don't. For instance, they completely miss out the political part of it, which means that how, for instance, one truth is counterposed against another, and how, for instance, you know that the hegemonic truth is dispersed, is challenged, and is contested. All right, just give me half a minute because my laptop is about to be discharged. Just give me half a minute. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. So, do I have to take it that all of you are from Jadavpur University or some of you are from other universities as well?
Sir, I am from Mumbai University.
You are from
Mumbai
Bombay
University.
University or Mumbai University?
University of Mumbai.
Okay, all right. Which department is it?
Department of Civics and Politics.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I am from Dhanamajuri University, Imphal, Manipur.
Which university? Sorry, I missed it.
Dhanamajuri University.
Dhanamanjari University. Okay, great. Where is it located in Imphal? Can you tell me?
At Thangmaiban,
Oh,
at the heart of the Imphal city.
okay, great. Very good. Thank you. All right, we still have 4 or 5 minutes. But coming back, that Foucault's point was, to respond to Purvi's question again, is this, that Foucault was sort of 100% political philosopher. He and that there is an activist part of Foucault, which is often neglected by many scholars. Foucault was Foucault served as a journalist when, for instance, uh, Iran was passing through the Islamic Revolution in late 1970s. He was reporting from Iran, and those reports on Iran are excellent. Foucault was, for instance, a practitioner of alternative sexuality in Paris, and he died of AIDS. All of you know that. So, uh, in that sense, that Foucault had a politics. He was a perfectly political man, very unlike many of the scholars who are basically, and the non-activist scholars, for instance. Let us club them as postmodernists. They use it, for instance, uh, in order to challenge the, I'm sorry, they just say that the grand narrative is dead, but they don't use it as a political idiom, as an idiom of their politics. All right, but it's a very important question that Purvi asked. But at one level, that they're the same. Like I said, that my blunt answer to your question is no. There is no difference. All right, so shall we call it a day? Thank you very much.
Uh,
And yes,
okay, so anyone has any more questions? Okay, so you can conclude.
okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. I spoke a lot. Uh, that's a problem with the teachers. They speak a lot, but I enjoyed the questions which have been asked. They are few, but they were very they're brilliant, thoughtful questions. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience, and maybe that at some point we will again have opportunity of listening to each other. Thank you very much. Okay, so please allow me to log out. All right.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir.